The auction started at 9 in the morning, and I was the only bidder. That is not a figure of speech. The folding chairs in the Harlan County Clerk's office had been set out in 2 rows of 6, and I was sitting in one of them, and the other 11 were empty. The clerk, a man named Gerald who wore a bolo tie and did not look at me once during the entire proceedings, read the legal description from a laminated sheet in a voice that suggested he had read it many times before and expected nothing to come of it. Lot 9, Section 4, Harlan County Plat Records. 0.8 acres, County Road 7. Delinquent on taxes since 2019. Minimum bid, $20. I said $20. Gerald wrote something down. He asked if there were any other bids. He looked at the empty chairs. He looked at his sheet. He said sold, and stamped something, and that was the auction. It took 4 minutes. I had $360 in my checking account at First Cumberland Bank. I wrote a check for $20, and Gerald gave me a receipt and told me the deed would be processed within 30 days. He said it the way you say something to someone you do not expect to see again. I folded the receipt and put it in the inside pocket of my grandfather's barn coat, olive canvas, the lining torn at the left shoulder, and I walked out into a February morning that was gray and cold and not especially interested in what had just happened. My truck was parked on Center Street, a 2003 Dodge Dakota, dark green, 211,000 miles on the original engine. My grandfather had left it to me specifically, by name, in a separate clause of his will. It was the only thing he had left me by name. Everything else, all 114 acres of Coalfield Farm, the equipment, the outbuildings, the cattle, the mineral rights, had gone to my brothers. Dex was 27, my other brother was 24, I was 19, and I had been a minor when my grandfather wrote the will, and he had died before he could change it, and that was that. I sat in the truck for a while with the heat running. The receipt was in my pocket. I had not told my brothers I was coming here today. I had not told anyone. Outside the window, Harlan went about its morning. A man in coveralls crossed the street carrying a paper coffee cup. A truck from the county road department idled at the light. The mountains sat behind everything the way they always do in this part of Kentucky. Present, patient, not offering anything for free. I had $340 left. I had 0.8 acres I had never walked. I put the truck in drive and headed toward County Road 7 to see what I had just bought. County Road 7 runs north out of Harlan for about 3 miles before it stops being a road that anyone bothers to maintain. I knew this stretch. I had driven it my whole life without paying it much attention. It was just the road between town and the farm, the road I had ridden as a child with my face against the cold window glass, watching the ridge come and go. I had never thought about who owned the scrubby fields on either side of it. 2 months earlier, I had stood in the kitchen of Coalfield Farm while my older brother told me my options. He did not say it unkindly. That was the thing about him. He rarely said anything unkindly. He leaned against the counter with his coffee, and he laid it out the way you'd lay out a budget. The farm was his and our other brothers. That was just the fact of the will, and they were going to run it together, and there was work that needed doing. Always was, and if I wanted to stay on and help with the chickens and the garden and some of the lighter field work, there would be a room for me and my name on a small monthly allowance, and everyone would get along fine. He said, "Help," 3 times in 2 sentences. I counted. I asked him what the allowance would be. He said $200 a month. He said it the way a person says something they expect to be accepted without discussion. I looked at him across the kitchen, our grandfather's kitchen, the same linoleum, the same row of coat hooks beside the back door, my grandfather's barn coat still hanging on the 3rd hook from the left, and I understood that this was not a negotiation. This was a notification. I left 4 days later. I took the Dakota, which was mine outright, and a duffel bag, and my notebooks, and the cast-iron skillet my grandmother had used until her hands got too stiff to lift it. I did not take anything else. I did not make a scene. For 2 months I had been renting a room in town from a woman on Miners Creek Road, $60 a week, which meant that my grandfather's small insurance bequest, the money he had left me separately from the farm, was going out steadily with nothing coming in. The bequest had been $820. By February 14th, it had become $340, and I had just spent $20 of it on a piece of land nobody else wanted. The thing that stayed with me, driving out on County Road 7, was not anger. It had been anger at first, the first week, but anger is expensive and I couldn't afford it. What I had instead, by February, was something quieter and more useful, a kind of patience with a hard edge to it. The land was just ahead. I could see the cedar break from the road. I pulled the Dakota off the road and cut the engine and sat for a moment with my hands in my lap. It was a Tuesday, cold, but not bitterly so, the kind of February cold that sits in the air without any wind behind it, so it feels almost polite. The sky was white and even. I got out and walked to the edge of what was now, by the county's official record, my property. The first thing I noticed was the sound, or the absence of it. The cedar break along the north edge killed the road noise almost immediately, and inside that quiet, the land had its own small sounds. A sparrow moving through dry brush, the tick of cedar branches against each other, my own boots on frozen ground. The second thing I noticed was how completely the blackberry had taken it. I am not talking about a weedy field with some canes at the edges. The interior of that 0.8 acres was a wall. Blackberry 4 feet high in most places, thick enough that you could not see where the ground went, whether it was flat or broken or what lived underneath. The canes were dead and dormant in February, which made them brown and dry and visually honest about their density, and the density was considerable. I walked the perimeter first, which I could do because the edges near the road and along the fence lines had been kept low by the county mowing crew over the years, just enough to mark the boundary. The fence itself was cedar post, original to something much older, and most of it was down. Not recently down, the posts had been graying for years, and the barbed wire had gone slack and half returned to the soil in a few places, woven through with the root systems of the blackberry, as if the land had quietly decided to incorporate it. I made notes as I walked. Corner post still standing, northeast. 3 rails of old fence on the western edge, intact. In the southeast corner, a break in the blackberry canopy where something, a tree that had since died maybe, or a section of heavier soil, had kept the canes lower, and through that gap I could see actual ground, darker than the soil along the road, darker than I expected. I wrote, "Dark corner, N.E." Then I kept walking. The western edge was where I stopped. There was a depression there, maybe 8 feet across, maybe 12, subtle enough that I almost stepped into it rather than seeing it. The blackberry grew right up to its rim and then stopped, which was its own kind of signal, though I didn't know that yet. The depression was maybe 18 inches deep at its lowest point, and the bottom held a little standing water from the last rain. I stood at the edge of it for a while, looking down. I wrote, "Low spot, W edge, drainage, or something else." I didn't know yet, but I wrote it down. I was back at the truck when I heard the fence wire shift. Not a break, just a sound, the kind a post makes when someone leans against it with some weight. I turned. There was a woman standing at the property line, on the other side of what remained of a 3-strand wire fence that separated my lot from the adjacent acreage. She was older, maybe 70, maybe a little past it, wearing a brown canvas coat and holding a green thermos in one hand. She wasn't looking at me with concern or curiosity or any of the expressions I'd come to expect from people who watched me do things. She was just looking at the land. I walked toward her. She waited. She didn't introduce herself as a neighbor. She just held out the thermos and said, "You look cold." I was. I took it. The coffee was black and very hot. I handed it back after 2 swallows, and she poured herself a capful, and we stood on either side of that fence without saying much for a moment. The light was flat and gray, the way it gets in February, when the clouds have come in low and stayed. A crow crossed the field from west to east, and we both watched it go. Then she said, without looking at me, without being asked, "Eunice Vestal used to grow the best pole beans in this county off that little piece." I didn't say anything. I waited. "Planted them along the eastern edge," she said. "Had a trellis system she built herself, cedar posts and baling wire. You couldn't buy beans like that at the market. People used to ask her where she got her seed." She took a sip from the thermos cap. She'd just smile. I asked how long ago. She thought about it. "Last time I remember seeing her garden running full was maybe 71, 72. She slowed down after that. Knees." She paused. "She passed in 87. Property's been sitting since." 36 years of blackberry cane and cedar scrub, accumulating on top of whatever Eunice Vestal had built. The woman told me her name then. She lived on the parcel to the north, had for 43 years since she married. She'd known Eunice toward the end of Eunice's gardening years. "They used to trade seeds across this same fence line," she said. "I told her what I was thinking about doing with the lot. She nodded once, like it confirmed something she had already decided. She didn't say good luck. She didn't say it was a lot of work for one person. She said, 'I've got a broad fork you can borrow. Eunice's soil doesn't want a tiller. It wants to be opened, not broken. You'll know the difference when you feel it.' I said I'd take her up on that. She picked up the thermos, turned back toward her property, and said over her shoulder, 'Come by Tuesday.' I wrote that down too. I went by Tuesday. She handed the broad fork over the fence post without ceremony. 2 tines, worn wooden handles, the steel darkened from decades of use. I carried it back to the lot and set it against the Dakota's tailgate, and stood there a minute looking at what I'd bought. 3 weeks. That's how long it took to learn the shape of the place. The DR brush mower arrived on a Thursday in early March, loaded into the bed of a neighbor's F-250 by the man I'd bought it from off Facebook. $85, cash, and he threw in a spare belt. It started on the 3rd pull, and I ran it for 6 hours the first day, back and forth across the eastern third of the lot, stopping every 20 minutes to clear wrapped cane from the blade housing with a stick. The blackberry came out in mats. The cedar scrub was younger than it looked, root systems shallow enough that I could lever them free with the broad fork after the mower knocked them down. I worked from first light until I couldn't see well enough to trust my footing. I didn't count the hours. I counted the rows. By the 2nd week I had reached the center of the lot, and by the 3rd week I had pushed into the northwest corner, where the cedar was thickest and the ground fell away in a way I hadn't noticed from the road. The slope was subtle, maybe 8 inches across 15 feet, but it was consistent, and the soil there was darker than anywhere else I'd turned. Dense and almost black, the kind of color you don't see much in Harlan County without doing something to earn it. I was clearing the last of a cedar cluster when the mower's front wheel dropped. Not much, 4 or 5 inches. But the frame tilted, and I cut the engine and knelt down and pulled back a curtain of cane root with my hands and found the edge of something, a timber, rotted almost to fiber, running parallel to the ground at a slight angle downward. I cleared it by hand after that, an hour with the mattock, another 30 minutes pulling cane root with gloves. What emerged was a depression roughly 8 feet by 5, its perimeter lined with stacked fieldstone. The timber had been a door frame. The door itself had collapsed inward and rotted nearly flat. I could see the ghost of its planks pressed into the soil like a photograph. A root cellar. Hand-dug, hand-lined, probably dug before anyone in my family was born. I stood at the edge of it for a moment. The smell that came up from it was cold and mineral and airless, the way a place smells when nothing has breathed inside it in a very long time. I climbed down carefully, testing each stone with my boot before I trusted it, and that's when I saw the box. The box was olive drab, military issue, roughly the size of a shoebox but heavier, The latch was a swing bale, the kind that locks down over a steel loop. The rubber gasket seal had held. I could feel it resist when I worked the latch free, that small sigh of pressure releasing, the way a jar sounds when the seal finally gives. Inside was dry. Everything inside was dry. I carried it up out of the cellar and set it in the truck bed and drove it to Ruth's. It was past 4 by then, and the light was going amber and flat across the field. I knocked, and she opened the door before I could finish knocking, the way old people do when they've heard a vehicle on their gravel and already know. She put on water for coffee without asking. I set the box on her kitchen table, which was covered in a yellow oilcloth worn white at the corners. I opened it there, under the overhead light. A folded canvas pouch. Inside, a small hand-dug trowel, hand-forged by the look of the handle, with someone's initials scratched into the metal. EV. Below the pouch, a notebook, composition style, its cover water-stained but intact. And beneath the notebook, a small paper envelope, folded flat, the kind seed companies once sold singles in. Ruth sat across from me. She reached out and touched the cover of the notebook before I opened it, just her fingertips, the way you touch a shoulder. The first entry was dated April 3, 1951. The handwriting was small and controlled, more precise than I expected. Columns, almost. A date, a description of what was amended and where, what came up, what didn't. Eunice Vestal had kept records like a scientist, 20 years of them, entry by entry, through 1971. I read slowly. Ruth read alongside me, leaning over the table. On page 41, midway through the 1959 entries, a notation had been underlined twice. The dark corner never fails, deep black to 18 inches at minimum, always first to drain, never waterlogged. Below it, a rough sketch in pencil, nothing to scale, but clear enough, a rectangle, divided into quadrants. The marked corner was northeast. I looked at Ruth. She looked at the page. She said that sounded exactly right. She said Eunice used to call that corner her insurance. I picked up the seed envelope then. It had writing on the outside, penciled, faded to near nothing. Ruth took it and held it under the light and read it without her glasses, which surprised me. She set it down carefully and said they were zinnias. She said Eunice spent years on them, selecting seed every fall, crossing for color and stem length, and that she had never sold them or shared the variety outside this land. The envelope was still full. I could feel the seeds shift when I tilted it, dry and small and waiting inside. I planted the garlic on the first Saturday of March, a morning cold enough that my breath came out in short white puffs, and the ground resisted the broad fork until I leaned my full weight onto it. Ruth had brought the fork over the evening before, set it against my truck without knocking, and left before I could thank her. I worked the northeast corner first. The soil there was exactly what the notebook had said, dark and deep, giving way in long, clean slices. Nothing like the compacted clay at the western edge, where the cedar brush had been thickest. I pushed the fork in to its full depth 3 times at every station, and the difference was plain enough that I wrote it down. NE quadrant, 17 to 19 inches workable, black, no hard pan. SW edge, 9 inches, then clay, gray. I had bought 4 pounds of seed garlic from Harlan Farm and Feed on Pine Mountain Street, a hardneck variety, $8 a pound. I planted it 6 inches apart in rows, and covered each row and marked the end of each one with a cedar stick. The cedar posts I cut myself from the brushwork I had already cleared. I had 63 posts by the second week of March, rough and uneven but sound, and I drove them with a borrowed post maul that left my palms bruised for 4 days. Fencing was slow. The lot had an irregular boundary on the southern end, a jog in the property line that didn't match any obvious landmark, and I walked it 3 times with the plat map before I trusted my stakes. By the end of March, I had 3 sides fenced with salvaged woven wire I'd found rolled against the back wall of a collapsed shed on the lot itself. old wire, stiff with rust on the surface, but the gauge was heavy and it held tension without breaking. The hens came in early April. I drove down to Cumberland on a Tuesday, 40 minutes each way on Route 119, and came back with 6 buff Orpington pullets in a cardboard box that shifted and complained the whole way home. $8 each, $48 total. The coop I had built the week before from scrap lumber, salvaged off the same shed, rough work, but square enough, with a hardware cloth window and a latch that actually caught. I put the pullets in at dusk, and they settled almost immediately, which I took as a reasonable sign. That night I opened my own notebook, a plain composition book I had bought at the dollar store in Harlan in February, and wrote out every number from the previous 6 weeks. The garlic, $32. Wire staples and gate hardware, $19. The pullets, $48. My balance at First Cumberland Bank was $44. I wrote that number down and looked at it for a moment. Then I wrote the date beside it and closed the notebook. May came in dry the first week, then wet the second, the kind of alternating pattern that keeps you watching the sky every morning before you do anything else. I had planted the main beds in late April, green beans along the south edge, summer squash in the center rows, and a short run of tomato transplants I had started from seed on the windowsill of the room I was renting, 2 trays under a shop light I'd borrowed and never returned. The zinnias went in last, a separate row along the fence, grown from those dried seeds in the paper envelope. I wasn't sure any of them would take. The envelope was more than 50 years old, and the seeds inside were small and light as ash. But it was the garlic I kept coming back to. I had planted it in March, across the full length of the cleared ground, spacing it as evenly as I could by eye. By the first week of May, the difference was plain enough that I didn't need to measure it. In the northeast quadrant, the corner Eunice had called the dark corner never fails. The plants were a full hand's width taller than everywhere else, the leaves a deeper color, the stems thicker at the base. Everywhere else the garlic looked fine. In that corner, it looked like it was being taken care of by something I couldn't see. I had read her entries on that section of ground several times by then. She had never explained why it grew differently there. She just recorded it, year after year, the same notation. Dark corner strong. Whatever she knew about it she had kept in her head, and that knowledge was gone with her in 1987. So I tried to find it myself. I had a length of half-inch rebar sharpened to a rough point at one end, left over from fencing. I started at the western edge of the lot in mid-May, on a morning after 2 days of rain when the ground was soft enough to probe. I pushed the rebar down every 2 feet and listened for what it hit. Mostly it hit nothing. Soft soil, then clay, then resistance that told me I was at bedrock depth. But about 18 inches in from the western fence line, I found something different. A hollow sound, or close to it, a give, and then a stop that wasn't clay. I probed the same line north and south, the same thing, about the same depth, running straight. I went and got a shovel. 14 inches down, I hit fired clay tile, old agricultural drainage, 4-inch diameter, fitted together in short sections. I cleared a 2-foot stretch of it and could see that it was still seated, still intact, still doing what it had been put there to do sometime before I was born. I sat back on my heels in the wet soil and looked at it for a while. The land had been working this whole time. I had just been too new to know where to look. By late June, the garlic had sent up scapes, and the tomato plants were past my knee. I had strung a second row of fence wire along the roadside in early June, and the lot had begun to look less like abandoned ground and more like something deliberate. You could see it from the road. That was new. I was on my knees pulling purslane from between the bean rows on a Thursday afternoon when I heard a truck slow on County Road 7. I recognized the engine before I looked up, a 2019 Ram, dark gray, with the Coalfield Farm magnetic sign on the door that Dex had made up 2 summers ago. Garrett. He pulled to the shoulder and left it running. I stood up and waited. He leaned out the window and looked at the lot the way you look at something that surprises you against your better judgment. He looked at the fence, at the tomato cages, at the 6 hens working the far corner. He looked at me. He said it looked like a lot of work for a small piece of ground. I said it was. He said he'd been talking to Dex. Said they'd been thinking that if I wanted to get out from under it, they could probably work something out, fold it into the farm's boundary, give me something fair for the investment I'd put in. He said he wasn't trying to be funny about it, said he was trying to be practical, said the lot didn't have the infrastructure for a real operation and that I'd be better positioned to build something if I wasn't stretched so thin. He meant it. That was the thing about Garrett. He almost always meant what he said. That didn't make him right. I told him I wasn't looking to sell. He nodded like he'd expected that but had to ask anyway. He looked at the field again and said I'd done a decent job clearing it. Then he asked if I needed anything. I said no. He put the truck back in gear and pulled out onto the road and was gone. I went back to the beans. From her porch across the fence line, Ruth had watched the whole thing without moving from her chair. She had a glass of something cold and she was shelling the last of her June peas into a bowl in her lap. When Garrett's truck disappeared around the bend, she took a long sip and set the glass down on the porch rail. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. That seemed right to both of us. Some things don't need commentary. He had come, he had looked, he had offered me a smaller version of the thing I already had. I had said no. The field had kept being the field. I finished the row before the light changed. The beans came first. By the first week of August, the northeast quadrant was so heavy with them, I was picking every other morning just to keep the plants from going woody. Eunice had been right about that corner. The dark corner never fails. And I understood now what she meant. The soil there held moisture differently, pulled it up from somewhere deeper, and the plants knew it. Green beans in 2 5-gallon buckets before 8 o'clock, then squash laid in crates in the bed of the Dakota, then tomatoes. The brandywines I'd started indoors in April coming in cracked and heavy and warm from the vine. The first Saturday I drove to the Harlan County Farmers Market on Central Street, I had $42 worth of produce if I priced it what I thought it was worth. I sold $89 worth. An older woman bought 3 pounds of tomatoes and came back 20 minutes later for 2 more. I drove home that afternoon with an empty truck bed and $89 in a cash envelope from the market manager, and my hands shaking a little from something that wasn't quite exhaustion. I went back 4 Saturdays in August, and then 4 more in September. I kept a running total in my notebook the same way I imagined Eunice had kept hers. Date, crop, pounds sold, price per pound, total. By the end of September, the column read $614. That covered the brush mower, the seed packets, the fencing, the hens and their feed, the registration fee for the market, and a roll of hardware cloth I'd bought for the coop in June. When I subtracted everything out, I had $270 left in the account at First Cumberland, more than I'd started with in February after the $20 purchase. I wrote the number down twice, not because I doubted it, because I wanted to see it again. The zinnias were last, the way flowers usually are when everything else has already done its work. They came up in the cutting row in early September, later than the packet had suggested, but I hadn't rushed them. When they opened, they were a deep coral orange, a color I didn't have a clean word for, something between fire and clay. Ruth came to the fence the morning they bloomed and stood there a long time without speaking. She had known what color they would be. I hadn't, until then. I cut a dozen for the market the last 2 Saturdays and sold every stem. What I didn't cut, I let go to seed. By early October, the heads were dry and papery. I sat on the tailgate one evening and cracked them open over a paper envelope, the same kind Eunice had used, and shook the seeds in and folded the top down and wrote the year on the outside with a marker. Then I put the envelope in my jacket pocket and went inside to make dinner. The showcase was held on October 21, a Saturday, at the county fairgrounds on US 421 south of town. I drove in before 7 in the morning, the Dakota's heater working poorly enough that I kept my grandfather's barn coat buttoned to the collar. In the bed of the truck, I had a flat of garlic bulbs wrapped in burlap, a mason jar of dried zinnia heads arranged so the coral showed through the glass, and a 2-page handwritten production summary I had copied out the night before onto unlined paper: acreage, soil amendments, yield by row, gross receipts for the season. I also brought Eunice's notebook. I hadn't planned to. It was in my jacket pocket because I'd been carrying it most of the fall the way some people carry a phone, reaching for it without thinking, reading a line while water heated on the stove. I brought it in with me when I set up my table in the agricultural annex, and I set it beside the garlic flat without deciding to. The county extension agent who came around to each table was named Dale Fugate, a tall man in his 60s with a Harlan County co-op cap and a clipboard. He moved slowly, asked short questions, wrote things down. When he reached my table, he looked at the garlic, looked at the summary, asked how many square feet the garlic occupied and what variety. I told him. He wrote it down. Then he saw the notebook. He didn't pick it up. He looked at me and asked what it was. I told him it belonged to the woman who had owned the land before me. He asked how far back it went. I said 1951 to 1971. He picked it up then, carefully, and turned to the first entry. He stood at my table reading for nearly 4 minutes without saying anything. Then he carried it to the 2 other people on the panel, and I watched them pass it between their hands. They came back together, the 3 of them. Dale Fugate asked if I had found the tile drain along the western edge. I said I had, in late March. He nodded once, like something had been confirmed. The Young Grower Recognition is a small maple plaque about the size of a hardback book. My name was engraved on it in block letters, and below that, Harlan County Fall Agricultural Showcase, 2023. Dale Fugate handed it to me himself and shook my hand with both of his and said the notebook was one of the better pieces of farm documentation he had seen in 30 years of extension work. I thanked him. I put the plaque under my arm. I carried the notebook back to my jacket pocket, where it had been all morning. I drove home in the early afternoon with the plaque on the passenger seat and the heater still blowing cold. They came the next morning, October 22nd, a Sunday. I heard the truck before I saw it, that particular sound a diesel engine makes on a gravel road when someone is driving slower than they usually would. I was in the field, pulling the last of the spent bean plants, when they parked along the fence on County Road 7. Both of them got out. They stood at the fence line and looked at the rows. I kept working for a moment, not to make a point, just because the beans needed finishing. Then I walked over. Neither of them spoke first. The older one looked at the garlic bed, already mulched for winter. The younger one had his hands in his jacket pockets and was looking at the hen yard, where the 6 buff Orpingtons were moving in their slow, deliberate way through the morning light. Nobody said anything for what felt like a full minute. The older one opened the gate and walked in. He went slowly down the center path between the beds, looking at the soil, not at me. He bent down once near the northeast corner. The dark corner never fails, and pressed 2 fingers into the earth. He stood back up without saying anything and kept walking. The younger one stayed by the truck. I watched the older one reach the far end of the field and turn around and walk back. When he got to the gate, he stopped. He looked at me, and then he looked at the plaque, which I'd left sitting on the tailgate of the Dakota. He didn't say much. What he said was quiet enough that I won't repeat it here, because it was between us. I said he was welcome to come back in the spring, if he wanted to see it green. He nodded. He went back to the truck. They drove out the way they came, slow on the gravel. I stood at the fence for a while after they left and looked at the field. The rows were straight. The soil in the northeast quadrant was dark and loose and smelled like something that had been working for a long time before I got there. That's what I want to say to you, if you've watched this far. There are things left in the ground. There are things left in steel boxes, in root cellars, in the back of drawers nobody has opened in 40 years. An old woman recorded 20 years of her work in a notebook and sealed it in an ammunition box, and it sat under the blackberry cane for 52 years until I needed it. I don't think that was an accident. I think she put it somewhere it would last. If you found something like that, in a barn, in a cellar, in your grandfather's handwriting, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs it.